The truck lurched over another rut, and Private Antonio Moetti braced himself against a wooden bench, his wrists bound with rope that smelled of machine oil and desert dust. The canvas tarp above them snapped in the wind. Someone was sobbing quietly in the corner, Corporal Ricky, who'd been telling jokes just 3 hours ago. Antonio closed his eyes and tried not to think about the mines. The propaganda officer in Tripoli had been very specific. The Americans would work them to death in desert labor camps. They'd force Italian prisoners to clear minefields with their hands, to dig tank traps under the Tunisian sun until they collapsed. Better to die fighting, the officer had said, than to suffer such degradation. Antonio had believed every word. The truck hit another bump, and his shoulder slammed into the soldier beside him, Private Luca, whose face was the color of ash. They'd surrendered together that morning, May 7th, 1943, after the British tanks had overrun their position near Tunis. The 72nd Infantry Regiment, or what was left of it, thrown their rifles down in the sand and raised their hands. Antonio remembered the strange gentleness with which the British sergeant had gestured for them to form a line. No shouting, no rifle butts to the ribs, just a tired nod toward the road where American trucks were waiting. That had been the first surprise. Now, 23 years old and a prisoner of war, Antonio watched the desert pass through the gap in the canvas. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sand in shades of copper and gold. He tried to memorize the landscape, this last beauty before whatever came next. His mother would want to know if he ever made it home to write her, if he survived long enough to hold a pencil. The American driver up front was humming something. Antonio couldn't make out the melody over the engine noise, but the sound was light, almost cheerful. How could he be cheerful? Didn't he know what waited at the end of this road? The truck began to slow. Antonio's stomach clenched. Beside him, Lucas started to pray in a whisper, Santa Maria, Mater Dei Dio. They rounded a curve, and through the canvas gap, Antonio saw it. A sprawling complex of white tents, hundreds of them organized in perfect rows. Guard towers at the corners. Barbed wire fencing that glinted in the late afternoon sun. The labor camp. It had to be. But something was wrong. Between the tents, he could see, what was that? A wooden structure, too large to be a guard post. And beyond it, what looked like a parade ground, but men were running on it. Running in formation, like training exercises. Not the stumbling shuffle of prisoners worked to exhaustion. The truck rolled through the main gate. An American soldier waved them through without even raising his rifle. The gate guard was reading a newspaper. Antonio blinked, certain he'd misunderstood what he was seeing. But no, there it was, folded in a man's hands, and he glanced up at them with nothing more than casual interest before returning to his reading. As if a truck full of enemy prisoners was the most ordinary thing in the world. The vehicle came to a stop in a wide clearing. The engine cut off, and in the sudden quiet, Antonio heard something that made no sense at all. Music, not martial music, not work songs or commands barked in harsh American accents, but music, the kind that spilled from cafes on summer evenings in Rome. Someone was playing an accordion, and unless Antonio had completely lost his mind, that was laughter mixed in with the notes. The canvas flap opened, and an American sergeant peered in at them. He was young, maybe 19, with sunburn across his nose and a clipboard in his hand. "All right, gentlemen," he said in heavily accented but comprehensible Italian. "Welcome to Camp Philip Morris. Let's get you processed and fed." Fed. The word hung in the air like something from a dream. The sergeant gestured for them to climb down, and Antonio's legs almost gave out when his feet hit the ground. He'd been sitting for 3 hours, but it wasn't just stiffness that made him stumble. It was the sheer cognitive dissonance of what surrounded him. To his right, a group of Italian prisoners in clean fatigues was playing soccer. Actually playing soccer, with a real ball, on a marked field. One of them shouted something in Sicilian dialect, and the others laughed. A guard leaned against the fence watching them, but his rifle was slung over his shoulder, and he seemed more interested in the game than in preventing escape. To his left, men sat on benches outside a long tent, writing letters. Antonio could see the paper, the pencils in their hands, the concentration on their faces. One man looked up and caught Antonio's eye. He smiled, actually smiled, and called out, New arrivals. Don't worry, friends, the food's not bad. This way, the American sergeant said, leading them toward a low building with a red cross painted on the side. Medical inspection first. We need to make sure you're healthy. Get any wounds treated. Then you'll be assigned to barracks. Medical inspection. To make sure they were healthy. Antonio's mind was reeling. This couldn't be real. Any moment now, the facade would drop. They'd be herded into the mines, the rock piles, the labor details they'd been promised. This was some kind of cruel joke, a way to make the reality even more devastating when it came. But they passed another tent, and through the open flap, Antonio saw shelves. Rows and rows of shelves, stocked with, were those books? He slowed his pace, staring. Actual books, hundreds of them, organized like a library. An Italian prisoner sat at a small desk near the entrance, helping another man select something from a shelf. Keep moving, please, the sergeant said, but his tone was patient, not harsh. They entered the medical building, and a doctor, an actual American doctor with captain's bars on his collar, looked up from a desk and stood. "Good evening," he said in broken Italian. "I am Dr. Harrison. We check you now. Yes? Full health. Any sick? Any hurt?" Ricky, still pale and shaking, raised a trembling hand. "My foot," he whispered. "I think infected." The doctor nodded and gestured to a chair. "Sit. I look." Antonio watched, numb with shock, as Dr. Harrison knelt beside Ricky and carefully removed the corporal's boot. The wound was ugly. A week-old blister that had festered in the desert heat turned septic from dirt and sweat. The smell made Antonio's eyes water. The doctor didn't flinch. He examined it carefully, then spoke to a medic in English. The medic returned with hot water, clean bandages, and a small bottle. Iodine. Antonio recognized the smell. "This hurt a little," Dr. Harrison said, his Italian halting but kind. "But we make it better. You will be okay." Ricky started crying again, but this time it was different. These weren't sobs of fear. Antonio couldn't quite identify what he was hearing in his friend's voice, but it made something twist in his own chest. The medical inspection took 40 minutes. They were checked for lice, for diseases, for injuries. When the doctor discovered that Antonio had a badly bruised shoulder from battle, he wrapped it with a bandage and gave him 2 white pills. "For pain," he said, "take with water." Pills. For pain. For an enemy prisoner's bruised shoulder. Outside, the sun had set, and electric lights, had come on throughout the camp. The American sergeant led them to a mess tent, and the smell that hit Antonio when they entered stopped him in his tracks. Food. Real food. Not the moldy bread and thin soup that had been their ration for the last month of fighting. Not the half-rotten vegetables they'd scavenged from abandoned farms. The smell of cooked meat, of tomatoes, of bread fresh enough that he could see steam rising from it. "Dinner's at 1800, the sergeant explained. "That's 6 o'clock civilian time. You'll eat with your barracks group. Breakfast at 0600, lunch at 1200. 3 meals a day, every day." 3 meals a day, every day. Antonio took the metal tray he was handed and moved through the line in a daze. A smiling American cook, a black man with sergeant stripes, which itself was strange. Antonio had been told Americans didn't let black men serve, spooned something onto his plate. Meat, actual meat, in some kind of rich sauce. Potatoes, green beans, a thick slice of white bread, and a piece of fruit, an orange, bright and heavy in his hand. He found a seat at one of the long tables, and Lucas sat beside him, staring at his own tray with an expression of pure bewilderment. Around them, other Italian prisoners ate and talked in normal voices. No one was being beaten. No one was being starved. The American guards stood along the walls, but they weren't watching with predatory intensity. They looked bored, if anything. Antonio picked up his fork and took a bite of the meat. It was good. Not just edible, not just adequate. It was actually good. Seasoned. Cooked properly. Hot. "Madonna," Luca whispered beside him. "What is happening?" If this story moves you, please hit that like button and subscribe. These moments from history deserve to be remembered. That first night, Antonio lay in a real bed with clean sheets and a pillow, staring at the canvas ceiling of his barracks tent. There were 30 men in the tent with him, and most were already asleep, their breathing soft and even. No one was crying. No one was dying. No one was screaming from nightmares or pain. He couldn't sleep. The propaganda officer's voice kept playing in his mind. Labor camps, death mines, brutal treatment. And yet here he was, fed and bandaged and warm, in a camp that looked more like a small city than a prison. In the morning, after breakfast, eggs, more bread, even coffee, they were gathered in a central area for orientation. An American lieutenant, speaking through an Italian-American translator, explained the rules. They were simple. No fighting. No escape attempts. Respect the guards. Attend daily roll call. In exchange, they would receive 3 meals a day, medical care, clean clothes, and the opportunity to work for pay. Pay! The Geneva Convention, the lieutenant said, and the translator repeated it in Italian, requires that prisoner of war labor be compensated. Those who choose to work will receive 80 cents per day in camp scrip. This can be used at the camp canteen for personal items, cigarettes, toiletries, writing paper, stamps. Antonio glanced at Luca. His friend's mouth was hanging open. Work is voluntary, the translator continued. No one will be forced. However, we have many positions available. Farm work in surrounding agricultural areas, kitchen duty, maintenance of the camp facilities, construction projects. We treat all workers fairly and provide appropriate breaks and water. Voluntary work, for pay. A hand went up in the crowd. One of the older prisoners, a sergeant from somewhere in the north. What kind of work? He asked. Mining? Clearing explosives. The lieutenant shook his head. No, primarily agricultural work. This is cotton country. Some of you will be assigned to cotton farms, helping with the harvest. Others will work in vegetable fields, orchards. Some will help with construction of roads and buildings here in Alabama. Alabama. So they were in America. Then they'd been shipped across the ocean while Antonio was still processing his capture. He tried to remember the journey, but those first weeks were a blur of confusion and shock. How long? Another prisoner called out. How long will we be here? The lieutenant's expression grew more serious. Until the war ends. We hope that will be soon, but we cannot say for certain. What I can say is this. While you are here, you will be treated according to the rules of the Geneva Convention. You are prisoners of war, yes, but you are also human beings entitled to dignity and fair treatment. Dignity. The word seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. That afternoon, Antonio volunteered for farm work. He needed to do something, to move, to think. They were loaded onto trucks again. He tensed, waiting for the facade to crack. But the trucks took them to a vast cotton field where an elderly American farmer met them with a tired smile. Hot day for it, the farmer said through the translator. We'll work until 1400. That's 2 in the afternoon. Then break for the heat. Cold water and shade over there. He pointed to a large tree with a water barrel underneath it. Every hour, 15-minute rest. Anyone feels sick, you say something. Nobody dies on my watch. Understand. The translator relayed this, and several of the prisoners laughed. Nervous, disbelieving laughter, but laughter nonetheless. Antonio stepped into the field and began picking cotton. The work was hard, the sun brutal, but it wasn't the death sentence he'd been promised. And true to the farmer's word, they broke every hour for water. The farmer's wife brought out sandwiches at noon, thick sandwiches with meat and cheese, and told them through the translator to sit in the shade and eat their fill. Strong workers need good food, she said matter-of-factly, as if feeding enemy prisoners generously was the most natural thing in the world. By the end of the first day, Antonio's hands were raw and his back ached, but he'd earned 80 cents. 80 cents, that was his, that he could spend however he wished. He and Luca walked back to camp in the truck, too tired to talk much, but when they passed through the gate, Luca said quietly, They are not lying to us, are they? This is real. Antonio looked at his hands, at the cotton fibers still clinging to his sleeves, at the camp spread out before them with its soccer field and library and mess tent. I think so, he said. God help me. I think it's real. The weeks became months, and slowly the cognitive dissonance began to fade. Antonio started to accept that this wasn't a trick, that the Americans genuinely intended to honor the Geneva Convention. More than that, they seemed to want to. He discovered the library properly on a Sunday afternoon. It was housed in a large tent near the center of camp, and when he ducked inside, the Italian prisoner manning the desk, a former school teacher named Martelli, greeted him warmly. "First time?" Martelli asked. Antonio nodded, looking around in wonder. There had to be 2,000 books here, maybe more. Italian novels, technical manuals, history books, even some English textbooks for those who wanted to learn the language. American Red Cross donated most of them, Martelli explained. The camp commander requested materials in Italian specifically. He said. Martelli paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. He said that men who can read are men who can hope. Antonio ran his fingers along the spines. Dante, Manzoni, Verdi, the literature of home, preserved here in the middle of Alabama. "Can I?" he started. "Take whatever you like. 2-week lending period. Return them here when you're done." Antonio selected a worn copy of the Divine Comedy and carried it back to his barracks like a treasure. That night, instead of staring at the ceiling, he read by lamplight until his eyes grew heavy. When he finally slept, he dreamed not of war but of Florence, of poetry, of beauty. The camp had a soccer league. Antonio learned this when Luca dragged him to watch a match between Barracks 7 and Barracks 12. The field was regulation size, the goals properly constructed. The prisoners had formed teams, elected captains, and created a full tournament schedule. American guards stood watch, but they cheered for good plays regardless of which team made them. "Bravo!" One guard shouted when a player from Barrack 7 scored a beautiful goal. The guard was grinning. Antonio found himself grinning too. He couldn't help it. This was absurd. This whole situation was insane. They were prisoners of war, captured enemies, and yet here they were playing soccer while their captors applauded. "Next week, you play," Luca said. "Barracks 9 needs a midfielder." Antonio shook his head, but he was still smiling. "I'm terrible at soccer." "Everyone's terrible at soccer. That's not the point." The point, Antonio was beginning to understand, was that they were being allowed to be human, to play, to compete, to have petty arguments about offsides calls and celebrate victories that meant nothing and everything. He started playing the following week. He was, as he'd warned, terrible, but it didn't matter. For those 90 minutes, he wasn't a prisoner or a soldier or a failure who'd lost a war. He was just Antonio, chasing a ball across a dusty field, laughing when he missed an easy pass, drinking water during halftime while Luca criticized his footwork. The camp had a theater group too. Prisoners who'd been actors or musicians before the war organized performances, plays, concerts, variety shows. They built a small stage in one of the larger tents and hung curtains made from dyed bedsheets. The American commander attended the first performance, a comedy by Goldoni, and applauded along with everyone else. Antonio went to see a concert in September. A prisoner named Rossini, no relation to the composer, but he joked about it endlessly, had somehow fashioned a violin from scrap wood and wire. It wasn't beautiful, but it worked, and when Rossini played Vivaldi, the rough notes transformed the tent into something sacred. 300 men sat in absolute silence, listening. Some wept openly. Antonio closed his eyes and let the music wash over him, feeling something crack open in his chest. Homesickness, yes. Grief for everything they'd lost. But also, gratitude? Was that what this feeling was? After the concert, he returned to his barracks and pulled out the paper and pencil he'd purchased at the canteen with his work earnings. He'd been avoiding this for months, uncertain what he could possibly say, but now the words came. Carissima Memma, I am alive and well. I am a prisoner of the Americans, but please do not worry. They feed us 3 meals every day. I have a bed with clean sheets. There's a library where I can read Dante. Yesterday I played soccer. Tomorrow I will work in the cotton fields and earn money for stamps so I can send you this letter. I do not understand why they are kind to us. We were their enemies. We tried to kill them. But they give us food and medicine and books and music. They call us sometimes. An American guard helped me fix my broken shoelace last week without being asked. The propaganda officer in Tripoli told us we would die in labor camps. He was wrong about everything. I think he was wrong about many things. I miss you. I miss home. I miss the smell of your kitchen and the bells of Santa Maria. But I am not suffering. Please tell Papa I am alive. Tell him I am learning things I do not yet understand. Your son, Antonio. He mailed the letter the next day, paying for the stamp with his work script. The American postal clerk stamped it without comment and added it to the outgoing mail pile. Antonio watched it disappear into the bag, wondering if it would ever reach Rome, if his mother would ever read his words, if she would believe them if she did. Winter came, and with it, a new reality. The Americans were winning the war. Everyone knew it, even if no one said it aloud. Italy had surrendered in September of 1943. The newspapers in the camp, Italian-language papers that the American provided, reported the news without censorship. Mussolini had been deposed. The new Italian government had switched sides. Technically, Italy and America were now co-belligerents against Germany. But the prisoners remained prisoners. The war wasn't over, and the Americans couldn't simply release them. So the strange existence continued. Enemy soldiers who were no longer enemies, held in camps that felt less like prisons with each passing month. The camp commander, Colonel Bradford, called an assembly in November. He was a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes, and he spoke through the translator with unusual gravity. "Gentlemen," he said, "your country has surrendered. The war in Italy is effectively over. Some of you may wonder why you remain here, why you are not sent home immediately." The crowd was silent, hundreds of men waiting for an answer. The truth is complicated. Transportation is limited. The war with Germany continues. And Bradford paused. "And frankly, some of you may not have homes to return to. The fighting in Italy has devastated many regions. What we can offer you, for now, is continued safety, food, and shelter here. We can offer you work and fair pay. When the war ends, when Europe is stable, you will have the choice to return or to remain." Remain. The word rippled through the assembly like a stone dropped in still water. "Those who wish to stay in America after the war," Bradford continued, "will be given assistance in doing so. We will help you find work, obtain proper documentation. You have worked hard. You have been good men, cooperative and respectful. America has need of good men." That night, the barracks buzzed with conversation. Some men were adamant about returning home. They had families waiting, villages to rebuild, a duty to Italy. But others, like Luca, spoke quietly about staying. "What's waiting for me in Naples?" Luca asked Antonio. "My father's bakery was bombed. My mother is living with my aunt in the mountains. The city is rubble." Antonio didn't have an answer. He thought about Rome, about his parents' small apartment, about the life he'd left behind. But he also thought about the cotton fields, the library, the soccer matches, the American farmer's wife who brought sandwiches, the doctor who treated Ricky's foot without hesitation, the guard who'd help with his shoelace. "I don't know," he said finally. "I don't know what any of us should do." The winter passed. Spring came. Antonio continued to work in the fields, and his English improved enough to hold simple conversations with the farmer. The man's name was Robert Owens, and he was 63 years old, with a son fighting somewhere in the Pacific. "You're a good worker," Owens told Antonio one afternoon, the two of them sitting under the shade tree during their break. "Steady hands. Good with the plants." Antonio's English wasn't good enough to express what he wanted to say, so he settled for, "Thank you, sir." "When this is all over," Owens continued, "when they let you boys go, you ever think about staying? 'Cause I could use a steady hand on this farm. Pays fair. Work's honest." Antonio stared at him. "You offer me job?" "I if you want it. No pressure. Just think about it." That evening, Antonio wrote another letter to his mother. He told her about Owen's offer. He told her about the life he could have here, the possibility of a future in this strange country that had treated him with more humanity than he'd experienced in his own army. "I do not know if this makes me a traitor," he wrote. "I do not know if I am betraying Italy by considering this. But I think about what you always told me, that a man must live with dignity, that honest work is sacred, that kindness matters more than flags. The Americans have shown me kindness I did not deserve. They fed me when they could have starved me. They gave me books when they could have given me brutality. They paid me for my work when they could have forced me to labor for nothing. I am not sure what loyalty means anymore. I am not sure what home is. He never sent that letter. He kept it in his footlocker, reading it sometimes late at night, turning the questions over and over in his mind. May of 1945 brought news of Germany's surrender. The war in Europe was over. In the camp, the prisoners gathered around radios, listening to the broadcast in English and Italian, trying to comprehend that it was finished. The fighting had stopped. The dying had ended. They were still prisoners, but now they were prisoners waiting for resolution. Colonel Bradford addressed them again. "Transportation is being arranged," he said. "Over the coming months, those who wish to return to Italy will be repatriated. Those who wish to remain in America may apply for immigration status. We will help you either way." Antonio made his decision on a Tuesday morning in June. He was working in the cotton field, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of 2 years' labor, when he realized he could see himself doing this in 10 years, 20 years. Growing old in Alabama, sending money back to Italy to help his parents, maybe starting a family here, learning to call this place home. It felt like betrayal. It felt like survival. It felt like both. He applied to stay. The process took months. There were interviews, paperwork, background checks. The American immigration officer who processed his application was a woman named Mrs. Henderson, and she reviewed his file with careful attention. "You've had good conduct reports from the camp," she said. "No disciplinary issues. Strong work record. Mr. Owens has submitted a letter of sponsorship for employment." She looked up at Antonio. "Why do you want to stay in America?" Antonio had practiced this answer in English, but the words still came out halting. "In my country, I have nothing. War destroy everything. Hey, I have opportunity. Respect. I work hard. I be good American." Mrs. Henderson studied him for a long moment. Then she stamped a form and handed it to him. "Welcome to America, Mr. Moetti. Don't make me regret this." He didn't. 73 years later, Antonio Moetti sat on the porch of his Alabama farmhouse, watching the sunset over cotton field he'd worked for half a century. At 96, his hands were gnarled with arthritis, but his memory remained sharp. His grandson, third-generation American, studying engineering at Auburn, recorded his story for a school project. "So they just treated you well?" the young man asked, "even though you were the enemy?" Antonio nodded. "Not because we deserve it, because they believe that even enemy can be human. That cruelty is choice, not necessity." "And you never went back to Italy?" "I visit 3 times. But this..." He gestured at the farm. "This is home now. America gave me second chance when I have no right to expect it. Do you think it changed you?" Antonio considered the question carefully. "It teach me that how you treat people when you have power over them, this reveals who you are. The Americans have all power over us. They could do anything, but they choose humanity. They choose to see us as men, not as things." The sun was nearly gone now. Antonio's wife called that dinner was ready. The young man helped his grandfather stand, and together they walked into the house, a house built with money earned from cotton and hard work and dignity. The story of Italian prisoners of war in America remains one of World War II's lesser-known chapters. Of approximately 51,000 Italian prisoners held in the United States, over 2,000 chose to remain after the war. They became farmers, factory workers, restaurant owners. They married, raised children, and built American lives. Many spoke of the shock of humane treatment when asked why they stayed. 3 meals a day, medical care, libraries, soccer leagues, being paid for their work and treated with basic human dignity when they expected brutality. The Geneva Convention required only minimal treatment, adequate food, shelter, and safety. But American camps provided more: recreation, education, cultural programs, fair wages. This wasn't universal, but the overall approach was remarkably humane. Why? Practical concerns played a role. The United States had prisoners in enemy hands and wanted to demonstrate proper treatment. But there was also something deeper, a belief that even enemies deserved to be treated as human beings. For men like Antonio Moetti, this made all the difference. They arrived expecting death camps, prepared for brutality. Instead, they found cotton fields and libraries, sucker matches and doctors who bandaged infected feet without hesitation. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Everything they'd been told was wrong. And in the space between expectation and reality, a transformation occurred. They learned that propaganda lies, that enemies can be humane, that the choice between cruelty and dignity exists even in war, and that sometimes, incredibly, people choose dignity. This doesn't erase the horror of World War II. It doesn't make war noble, but it suggests something important about the choices we make in the worst circumstances, about what we do when we have complete power over other human beings. The Americans who ran these camps weren't saints. They were ordinary people making choices, to provide libraries, to organize soccer leagues, to pay fair wages, to treat infected feet, to call prisoners sir. Small choices, daily choices, choices that convinced thousands of enemy soldiers that perhaps their enemies weren't so different from themselves. Antonio Moetti died in 2018 at 98, an American citizen, survived by children and grandchildren who'd never known any other country. He told his story dozens of times over his long life, wanting people to know what it felt like to expect brutality and receive kindness instead. They could have treated us like animals, he told his grandson. Instead, they treated us like men. This small difference between animal and man, it changed my entire life. In the end, perhaps that's a lesson. Even in the midst of war and captivity, we have choices. We can choose cruelty or kindness. We can choose to dehumanize or to recognize humanity. The Americans in 1943 made their choice. Thousands of Italian prisoners discovered what that choice meant. Some of them never left. And in staying, they testified to something that war tries to destroy but sometimes fails to extinguish, the possibility that even enemies can recognize each other's humanity, and that this recognition changes everything.